The morning Alberta Wells walked into the dusty office of the Broken Spur Ranch. There were three men sitting outside on the porch who took one look at the posting nailed to the wooden beam and walked away without even knocking on the door. She had read that posting herself twice in the window of the general store in Caldwell, Kansas, where she had arrived by stagecoach 2 days prior with 43 cents, a carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world, and a determination so fierce it could have cut glass. The year was 1878, and Kansas was not kind to women traveling alone, but Alberta had never much cared for kindness when survival was available instead. The posting had read in rough handwritten letters that suggested the man who wrote it did not enjoy the task. Ranch hand needed, Broken Spur, 7 miles north of Caldwell, hard work, fair pay, room and board included. Inquire with Theodore Hawkins. This job has been available for 6 weeks. Do not apply if you are afraid of difficult circumstances. 6 weeks. That detail had caught her eye more than anything else. She had worked enough jobs in her 26 years to know that a position sitting empty for 6 weeks in a region where men were desperately seeking employment meant one of two things. Either the rancher was an absolute tyrant, or the conditions were genuinely dangerous. She was counting on the former, because she could handle a difficult man far easier than she could handle starvation. She knocked on the door of the ranch house with a firm, unhesitating knock that startled even herself with its confidence. There was a long silence from within, then the sound of heavy boots crossing a wooden floor, a latch being lifted, and the door swung open to reveal Theodore Hawkins. And Alberta Wells had to work very hard in that moment to keep her expression from betraying her surprise. She had expected a tyrant. She had expected someone weathered and bitter and small in the way that small men tried to make themselves large. What she had not expected was a man of perhaps 30 years standing in the doorway with flour on his hands, a look of considerable exhaustion around his dark brown eyes, and 3 inches of height on her that put him at well over 6 feet. His hair was dark, slightly too long, curling at the collar of a work shirt that had seen better days. There was a jagged scar along his left jaw that suggested a story she did not yet know, and his expression was one of absolute wariness that she recognized immediately because she wore it herself most mornings when she looked in the mirror. "I am here about the job," she said. Theodore Hawkins looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the carpet bag she was holding. He looked at her traveling dress, which was practical wool and not the fashionable kind, and at her hands, which were calloused in ways that hands did not get calloused from sitting in parlors. "You are a woman," he said. It was not rude exactly. It was more like a man confirming something that confused him deeply. "That observation is correct," Alberta said. "I am also experienced with cattle, horses, fence repair, crop management, and general ranch maintenance. I have worked on 3 ranches in Missouri and 1 in the Oklahoma Territory. I have a letter of reference from a Mr. Cyrus Albright of Independence if you would like to see it." He stared at her. "The job," she continued, because she had learned that silence worked in her favor when she filled it before the other person could fill it with a no, "has been sitting empty for 6 weeks. I saw 3 men look at your posting and walk away without even trying. I did not walk away. That should tell you something." Theodore Hawkins leaned against the doorframe and crossed his flour-dusted arms over his chest. He had the look of a man who was doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the numbers he was getting. "Come inside," he said finally. "I will make coffee." The inside of the Broken Spur Ranch house was a revelation of organized chaos. There were papers on every surface, ledgers open on the kitchen table, a pair of children's boots sitting near the hearth, a crayon drawing pinned to the wall near the window, and the general sense of a space that was being managed by someone who did not have enough hours in the day. The kitchen showed evidence of someone's interrupted cooking. There was a pot on the stove and a half-mixed bowl of batter sitting on the counter, and the flour on Theodore Hawkins's hands suddenly made a great deal more sense. He poured coffee from a pot that was already made, and set a cup in front of her at the kitchen table without ceremony. He sat across from her and pulled one of the ledgers toward himself with the automatic gesture of a man who could not be in a room with an open account book without reaching for it. "Tell me about Cyrus Albright's ranch," he said. So she told him. She told him about the Albright spread in Independence, which ran 300 head of cattle and 30 horses, and where she had spent 2 years as the only female hand in a crew of 8. She told him about the ranch in the Oklahoma Territory, which she did not name because she did not want to explain the circumstances under which she had left it, though she would tell him the truth if he pressed her for it. She told him about fence repair in Missouri and breaking horses in the summer heat and managing feed stores through a winter that had killed half the livestock on every other ranch for 50 miles. Theodore Hawkins listened with his elbows on the table and his coffee cup held in both hands, and he watched her the way a man watches something that is either a mirage or the most useful thing he has ever seen in his life, and is not yet sure which. "Why did you leave Albright's ranch?" he asked. Mr. Albright's son returned from the East with ideas about how the ranch ought to be run that I did not agree with, she said. He believed that the best way to improve the herd's quality was to sell the established stock and buy new. I believed that destroying 6 years of careful breeding to follow a fashion was foolish. We disagreed about this loudly and repeatedly until Mr. Albright told me that one of us would have to go, and since his son was his son, it was going to be me. "Were you right about the breeding program?" "Yes," she said simply. "I usually am." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "The reason nobody wants this job," he said, setting down his coffee cup, "is that this ranch is in a considerable amount of trouble. I have 6 hands and I have lost 4 of them in the past 2 months, 2 to a ranch down the road that pays more, 1 to a mining claim in Colorado, and 1 to a fever that he stopped. He passed in March. I have 2 hands left, both reliable, both overworked. I have 340 head of cattle, 80 horses, 1,200 acres, and a fence line that is in a sorry state. I also have a daughter who is 7 years old and who has not had proper looking after since her grandmother went back to Abilene in January." Alberta heard the shape of that sentence and understood it. A daughter, no mention of a wife. "I cannot pay what a larger ranch would pay," he continued, "but I will pay fair wages and the room and board is genuine. There is a bunkhouse that currently houses only 2 people. It is comfortable enough. The work is hard and there is a great deal of it." "I have already told you I am not afraid of hard work," she said. He looked at her steadily. "The men who have been here before," he said carefully, "were not always respectful." "I have managed disrespectful men before," Alberta said. "I generally find that a clear and early demonstration of competence resolves the issue within the first week. And if it does not resolve itself, then I resolve it by other means," she said, "and I have never yet had to resort to anything more dramatic than a firm conversation." This time he did smile, and it changed his face so entirely that she felt something shift in her chest that she had not felt in a long time and could not at present afford to examine. "When can you start?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "if you will let me sleep in the bunkhouse tonight." "I will show you where everything is," he said, and stood, and that was the beginning of it all. The bunkhouse at the Broken Spur was a solid building, well made in the way that suggested the man who had built it had cared about doing it properly. There were 4 bunks, 2 on each side, and a small iron stove, and pegs on the wall for gear, and 2 windows that let in the prairie wind when they were open. The other 2 hands, Alberta learned, were brothers named Samuel and Eli Crest, both from Texas, both in their early 30s and both so relieved to have another body on the ranch that they greeted her with something close to warmth and only the minimum amount of skepticism that the situation required. "You really done ranch work before?" Samuel asked over supper that first evening, which was taken in the main house because Theodore apparently cooked for the whole crew as part of the arrangement, and apparently cooked well enough that nobody had complained about this system. "I really have," Alberta said, "because Hawkins needs someone who can actually do the work," Eli said, not unkindly. "We are not in a position to carry anybody." "Nobody is going to carry me," Alberta said. "If anything, I expect I will be helping to carry some of the load that the two of you have been managing alone." Samuel and Eli looked at each other and then back at her, and something passed between the brothers in the way that things pass between people who have been through hard circumstances together, and then Samuel nodded once. "Fair enough," he said, and handed her the bread. At the head of the table, Theodore Hawkins said nothing, but Alberta noticed that he watched her throughout the meal with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of cautious reassessment, which was apparently what he did instead of making assumptions. The little girl appeared just before dessert. She came down the stairs with her dark hair in two braids that were slightly coming undone, wearing a nightdress and carrying a stuffed rabbit with one eye, and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs when she saw Alberta sitting at the table. Her name was Mee, Alberta would learn. Mee Hawkins, 7 years old, and she had her father's dark eyes and a small grave face that was taking Alberta's measure with a thoroughness that rivaled Theodore's own. "Who are you?" Mee asked. "My name is Alberta Wells," Alberta said. "I am going to be working on the ranch." "Are you a cowgirl?" Mee asked, with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften her questions. "I suppose I am," Alberta said. "I have never heard myself called that, but I suppose it fits." Mee considered this information with great seriousness. "Papa said nobody wanted the job," she said. Theodore made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and the start of a sentence he was thinking better of. "I wanted it," Alberta said. "I was the one who wanted it." Mee looked at her father. "She wanted it, Papa." "I am aware," Theodore said, and the ghost of that smile was back. Mee came and sat in the chair beside Alberta with the naturalness of a child who had decided something and acted on it immediately, and she placed her stuffed rabbit on the table and said, "His name is Captain. He lost his eye in a battle." "That sounds like a very brave rabbit," Alberta said with full sincerity. "He is," Mee agreed. "Are you brave?" Alberta thought about 43 cents and a carpetbag and a stagecoach and knocking on a door that 3 grown men had walked away from. "I am working on it," she said. Mee seemed satisfied with this answer. She reached across and patted Alberta's hand with her small, warm fingers, and Alberta felt something in her chest do something she absolutely could not deal with at present, and so she looked down at her pie and ate it carefully and professionally. The first week was a revelation of work. Alberta rose before dawn and went to bed after dark, and in between she did the kind of labor that the human body remembers long after the mind has stopped tracking it. She fixed fence line in the east pasture where 3 posts had rotted through, and the wire had come down in a 20-yard stretch. She checked cattle in the north field and identified 2 animals showing early signs of illness that Theodore, stretched too thin to catch everything, had not yet noticed, and she described the symptoms to him at supper, and he looked at her with an expression that she was learning to read as the one he wore when something surprised him. "How long have you been watching them?" he asked. "Since Tuesday," she said. "I did not want to say anything until I was certain." "You should have said something Tuesday," he said, but his voice was not sharp about it. "Now you know for next time," she said. He sent for the veterinarian the following morning, and the 2 animals were treated and recovered, and the 3rd morning after that Theodore said to her over coffee, without looking up from his ledger, "Good catch." She said, "Thank you," and did not make a larger thing of it than it was, which she suspected was the correct response with this particular man. By the end of the 2nd week, something in the dynamic of the broken spur had begun to shift. Samuel and Eli had stopped working around her and started working with her in the way that people do when they have genuinely accepted another person as a partner rather than a problem. Theodore still watched her with that careful assessment, but it was changing in character from wariness to something she could not yet name. Mee, for her part, had decided within the first 3 days that Alberta was fascinating, and this manifested in the girl's tendency to appear in whatever location Alberta happened to be working, and to ask questions at a volume that suggested she had a great deal of stored-up conversation that needed to come out. "Why is your hair that color?" Me asked one afternoon, sitting on the fence rail while Alberta worked on replacing a wooden post. "What color do you think it is?" Alberta asked, tamping the post down with steady strokes. "It is red," me said, "but not the same red as a sunset. More like the red in a fire when it has been going for a while and is not brand new." Alberta considered this. "That is a very good description," she said. "Papa says I notice things," me said, with a satisfaction that was clearly reported rather than invented. "Your papa is right," Alberta said. Me was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Alberta looked over at her. "Do you think you will stay?" Me asked, and her voice had gone careful in the way children's voices go when they are asking something that matters a great deal to them. Alberta set down the tamping bar and looked at the small, serious girl with her dark eyes and her undone braid and her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "I intend to," she said honestly. "I am not in the habit of starting things I do not finish." Me nodded slowly, processing this. "Mrs. Gruber from town came to look after me in January," she said. "She stayed 2 weeks, and then she said the ranch was too remote and she left. And before that there was a man named Peters who came to work the cattle, and he stayed 3 weeks and then he left too." She paused. "A lot of people leave." Alberta understood then, with sudden clarity, the real reason the job had sat empty for 6 weeks. It was not the hard work or the poor pay or even the remote location. It was something more complicated. It was a ranch that felt like it was waiting for something, holding its breath in a way that made people feel like visitors rather than residents, and visitors eventually went home. "I do not have anywhere else to go," Alberta said, which was true, and which she said not to be pathetic but because it was the most honest reassurance she could offer. "This is not temporary for me. This is where I am." Me reached over and patted her hand again, the same gesture she had used that first night, and Alberta thought that this child was possibly the most perceptive 7-year-old in all of Kansas. The trouble came at the end of the 3rd week, as trouble often did in Alberta's experience, from a direction she had anticipated, and in a form she had prepared for. A man named Cutter Rhodes arrived at the Broken Spur on a Thursday afternoon with 2 of his ranch hands at his back. He was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a costume, all broad shoulders and practiced drawl, and he had the look of someone who was accustomed to getting what he asked for and was genuinely baffled when he did not. He wanted to buy the north pasture. Theodore received him in the front yard, and Alberta was working nearby on a wagon that had a wheel in need of attention, and she kept her head down and her hands busy, because she had learned that the most useful thing a person could sometimes do was appear to not be paying attention. "I have made this offer twice before," Rhodes said. "I am making it a 3rd time because I am a patient man and I believe that eventually people understand where their interests lie." "My interests lie in keeping my land," Theodore said. His voice was flat and even in a way that Alberta was learning meant he was angry. "You are struggling," Rhodes said, and his tone was not unkind exactly but had the quality of someone pointing out an obvious fact to a child. "Everyone knows it. You lost half your crew. You are working short-handed. The north pasture alone would give you enough cash to keep this place afloat for 2 years. I appreciate your concern for my financial situation," Theodore said. "The answer is still no." Rhodes's gaze moved around the yard with the proprietary casualness of a man who believed everything he surveyed was eventually going to belong to him, and it landed on Alberta at the wagon. "You took on a woman hand," Rhodes said, in a tone that suggested this confirmed some theory he had about Theodore Hawkins's judgment. "She is the best hand on this property," Theodore said, which was said so flatly and matter-of-factly that it landed with considerably more weight than a passionate defense would have. Alberta kept her eyes on the wheel. Rhodes looked at her for another moment and then looked back at Theodore. "My offer stands," he said. "When you are ready to be reasonable, you know where to find me." After he rode out with his men, Theodore came and stood beside the wagon. Alberta handed him a wrench without looking up. "Has he been making this offer since you bought the place?" she asked. "Since 2 years after I bought the place," Theodore said. "He bought the Hammond Ranch to the east and the Pickett land to the west. He wants a continuous line to the river. And the north pasture is in the way." "The north pasture is the best grazing land on the property," Theodore said, "and he knows it." "What is he likely to do when Patience stops working for him?" Alberta asked. A pause. "I am not sure yet," Theodore said. "Then we should make sure the ranch is running well enough that there is no argument to be made that you are failing," Alberta said, "because that is the argument he will make next, that you cannot manage it." Theodore was quiet for a long moment. "That is already the argument he makes," he said. "Then let us give him nothing to point to," Alberta said. She handed him the wrench and stood up and wiped her hands on her work trousers. "I noticed the south fence needs attention too. I will start on that tomorrow." He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she could not quite name, and she felt her face do something warm and uncomfortable before she turned and walked toward the barn. What Alberta had not accounted for, in her careful planning and her professional management of the situation, was that living on the Broken Spur was not like the other ranches she had been on. The other ranches had been places of labor where she slept and ate and worked, and did not particularly belong. The Broken Spur was different in ways she noticed slowly, like the way the light fell across the kitchen table in the evenings when Theodore sat with his ledgers and Mee did her lessons and Alberta sat nearby mending tack, and how ordinary it felt to be there. How right. She noticed the way Theodore talked to Mee, patiently and seriously, as though the child's thoughts deserved the same consideration as an adult's. She noticed how he ran the ranch, not with the authority of a man who had inherited power, but with the careful attention of someone who had built something with his hands and understood every brick of it. He had bought the Broken Spur 7 years ago with money he had saved during 8 years of work on 3 different ranches. She learned this gradually, in pieces, the way you learn things about people when you live alongside them rather than sit across from them. His wife, Charlotte, had died 4 years ago. He told her this one evening in October, when they were the last two awake in the house, and the lamp was burning low and Mee had gone to bed an hour before. He said it simply and without drama, the way someone says a fact that has been said so many times it has worn smooth, and Alberta said, "I am sorry," and meant it with her whole chest. She was from Abilene, he said. She never quite took to the ranch. She found it lonely. He was quiet for a moment. "I have sometimes wondered if I could have changed that, made it less lonely for her." Alberta thought carefully about what she was going to say. "Some people are not made for this kind of life," she said. "It is not a failing in them or in the life. It is a mismatch." "Did you ever find it lonely?" he asked. "The ranching life?" She thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," she said, "but I think I am made for wide spaces. I am not comfortable in crowds. Out here, the quiet feels like company rather than absence." He looked at her then directly, and the lamp light did something to his eyes that she was absolutely not going to think about, and he said, "Yes, that is exactly it." She picked up her mending and concentrated on a stubborn stitch. "Where is your family?" he asked after a moment. It was a gentle question, not prying, the kind asked by a person who is beginning to want to know another person the way you know someone rather than the way you know of them. "My mother died when I was 14, she said. "My father worked for the railroad. He moved where the work moved and I went with him for a while, and then I stopped going and started working instead." She paused. "He is still somewhere, I expect. We are not close. Brothers, sisters." "A brother," she said, "younger. He married well and lives in Cincinnati, and we write letters at Christmas." "That sounds lonely," he said. She looked at him. "It has been," she said, "less so recently." The moment stretched between them in the lamplight, warm and full of something that neither of them had said out loud, and both of them were acutely aware of. And then Theodore cleared his throat and looked back at his ledger, and Alberta finished her stitch, and they sat in comfortable near silence, until the lamp burned too low to read by, and they said good night, and went to their separate beds, and Alberta lay in the bunkhouse, listening to the prairie wind, and thought very seriously about the fact that she was in considerable trouble of the most inconvenient and wonderful kind. November arrived with cold mornings and the smell of wood smoke, and the rhythm of the broken spur had settled into something that Alberta recognized as belonging to her now. She knew the names of all 340 cattle. She knew which horses were reliable and which needed a firm hand, and which one, a gray mare named Dust, would only allow Alberta to shoe her without trouble, and had given every other person on the property a bruise in the attempt. She knew which sections of fence line were aging fastest, and which pastures needed rotation, and where the creek ran shallow enough to ford on horseback and where it didn't. She also knew that Theodore Hawkins drank his coffee without sugar, and always added an extra log to the fire before he left the house in the morning, so it would still be warm when me came downstairs, and that he kept a book of poetry by the lamp beside his bed, which she had seen through the open door, and that he hummed tunelessly when he was concentrating on something difficult, and that he had a laugh that he used rarely and carefully, like good whiskey saved for occasions that merited it. She acknowledged to herself one cold morning while breaking ice on the water trough, absolutely and thoroughly in love with the man, and it was the most inconvenient thing that had ever happened to her in a life that had not been short on inconveniences. The reason it was inconvenient was threefold. First, she was an employee on his ranch, and she was not willing to compromise the professional relationship that was the foundation of her being able to stay here at all. Second, she had no evidence, none whatsoever, that Theodore Hawkins thought of her as anything other than the best hand he had ever hired, which was a form of respect she valued enormously, but which was not exactly the same thing as what she was feeling. Third, and perhaps most crucially, she was absolutely terrified. She had not been frightened of three men walking away from a job posting, or of introducing herself to a rancher who might turn her away, or of fixing fence line in freezing temperatures. But she was frightened of this, of wanting something this much and being wrong about it, and she was therefore not going to do anything about it whatsoever. This plan lasted until the third Thursday in November, when Cutter Rhodes came back. He came in the evening this time, which was different and deliberate, when the day's work was done, and the hands were in the bunkhouse and me was asleep upstairs. He came alone, which was more alarming than the two men at his back had been, because a man who comes alone is a man who does not intend to have witnesses. Alberta had been returning from the barn when she saw his horse tied at the post, and she came around the side of the house and stood in the shadow of the wall and listened, which she was not proud of, but which she was also not going to apologize for. "The offer is not going to stay on the table forever," Rhodes was saying. He was on the porch and Theodore was in the doorway, blocking entry in the easy, natural way of a man who did not need to make the blocking obvious. "You have said that before," Theodore said. "I mean it this time," Rhodes said. "I have a buyer interested in the full spread, Hawkins. The whole thing, not just the pasture. He would pay enough that you could start somewhere else, somewhere easier than this. I am trying to do you a kindness." "I have not asked for kindness from you," Theodore said. "Your operation is failing," Rhodes said, and now the kindness had dropped out of his voice and something colder had replaced it. "You have 2.5 hands and 600 acres of fence that need replacing and cattle that are not properly managed. The woman you hired is a liability you are letting your loneliness. I would be very careful," Theodore said, "about how you finish that sentence." There was a silence. "Come spring," Rhodes said, "I will make you an offer on the whole property. Think about it before you refuse. That is all I am saying." He left and Theodore stood in the doorway until the sound of the horse had faded, and then he turned and found Alberta standing in the yard. He looked at her for a moment. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough," she said. "He is not going to stop." "No," Theodore said, "he is not." "Then we need to think about this the way you think about a problem that is not going away," she said. "What does he actually need from you, the pasture or the whole ranch?" "Ultimately the whole thing," Theodore said. "The pasture is the excuse. Then the only answer is to make the ranch so clearly successful that his argument has no ground to stand on," Alberta said. and to make sure that the community around here knows it. Men like Rhodes operate through the story they tell. If the story he is telling is that you are failing, then we make sure everyone can see that you are not. Theodore stepped off the porch and came to stand near her in the cold evening air, and she could see his breath and hers mixing in the lamplight from the window. "You keep saying we," he said. She looked at him. "You say we need to think and we make sure," he said. "You have been doing it for weeks." "I work here," she said, aware that her voice was not quite steady. "The ranch's success is Alberta," he said. And the way he said her name, quiet and direct, with the kind of care that you put into saying something that matters, stopped her completely. She looked at him. "The job posting," he said. "The reason it sat empty for 6 weeks was not just the hard work or the pay." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words the way a man picks his footing crossing a stream. "The last hand I hired before you, a man named Dixon, he left because he said the place felt unfinished. Like something was missing from it." Another pause. "I think I understand now what he meant." Her heart was doing something so dramatic in her chest that she was grateful for the cold air giving her an excuse for the color in her face. "When you came to that door," he said, "you were the first person in 2 years who knocked on it like they intended to stay, like you were not trying it out, like you had already decided." "I had already decided," she said. "I told me that." "I know," he said. "She told me." Silence. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I need you to tell me honestly if it changes things between us, because I cannot afford to lose you from this ranch, but I cannot keep not saying it either." "Say it," she said. "I would very much like to court you," Theodore Hawkins said. "Properly and slowly if you are willing. I am not in a hurry. I am not asking for an answer to anything right now. I am only asking if you are willing to let me try." Alberta Wells stood in the cold November evening outside the Broken Spur Ranch house, with the wind coming across the prairie, and the lamp burning in the window and a man looking at her with those dark, serious eyes. And she thought about 43 cents and a carpetbag and a job nobody wanted, and she said, "I am more than willing." He smiled, and it was not the ghost of a smile this time. It was the real thing, full and warm, and it was possibly the best thing she had ever seen in her life. "Good," he said. "Then come inside. I made pie." The courtship of Alberta Wells and Theodore Hawkins was conducted in the manner of two people who had both spent a great deal of time being practical, and were now discovering that impracticality had its considerable charms. It was conducted in the small moments between work, in the way they walked together to the barn in the mornings, and the way he handed her coffee before she had asked for it, in the evenings by the fire where their conversations had always been easy but had now become something more, charged with the awareness of what was being built between them. He brought her wildflowers in December, which was not a traditional month for flowers on the Kansas prairie, but he had found a late-blooming variety along the creek and brought them wrapped in his handkerchief. And he stood in the bunkhouse doorway and held them out without ceremony, and she took them and put them in a tin cup with water and set them on the windowsill and looked at them for a long time after he had gone. She made him a book cover from leather for his poetry collection because the original cover had worn through, and she tooled a simple running horse along the edge because she had seen him watching the horses, sometimes the way she watched wide spaces, with the look of a person who finds peace in something. He held it in his hands for a long time and did not say anything, which she understood by now was his way of saying something very large. Me watched all of this with an expression of absolute satisfaction that suggested she had either orchestrated it or at minimum approved of it heartily. "You are going to be my mother," Me told Alberta one afternoon in February with the cheerful certainty of a child who has decided something is going to happen and is simply waiting for the adults to catch up. "Me," Alberta said carefully. "You are," Me insisted. "I have decided." "It is not entirely up to you," Alberta said with a smile she was working to contain. "I know," Me said, "but I have good instincts. Papa says so." Christmas at the Broken Spur was the warmest Alberta had experienced in years. Samuel and Eli stayed at the ranch rather than traveling, partly because the weather made travel difficult and partly because, as Eli said with the straightforward honesty of a man who did not bother with social indirection, "This feels more like home than anywhere I have been in a while, and I would rather be here." Alberta understood this completely. Theodore made a meal that was ambitious by the standards of what was available in a Kansas winter and delicious by any other standard. Me wore a dress with ribbons in it and presented everyone with drawings she had made, and Alberta's drawing was of two figures on horseback in a wide open field under a sky full of stars, and underneath it me had written, in her careful child's hand, "Alberta and Papa at the Broken Spur." Alberta kept that drawing folded in her breast pocket for a month before she transferred it to the box where she kept her most important things. The spring brought trouble before it brought relief, as springs often do. Cutter Rhodes made good on his promise to come back with an offer on the whole property, and he came this time with a lawyer from Wichita and a formal written document that had the look of something that had been prepared by someone who believed the answer was going to be yes. Theodore refused him in the yard, in front of Alberta and Samuel and Eli, and the lawyer from Wichita made a point of looking at the fence line and the condition of the outbuildings and making notes in a small book, and this made Alberta's blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. That evening she sat down with Theodore's ledgers, which he had never minded her looking at, and she worked through the numbers with the thoroughness she brought to everything. The ranch was not failing, but it was close enough to fragility that a bad season or a hard winter or a significant unexpected expense could tip it. The herd was healthy and the land was good, but they were undermanned and the equipment was aging, and there were repairs that had been deferred because there was not enough money to do everything at once. She sat with this information for 2 days, turning it over, and then she came to Theodore with a proposal. "You need to increase the herd by at least 60 head before autumn," she said, "and you need to hire 2 more hands. I know you cannot afford to do both things, but there is a way." She laid out what she had worked out, a plan that involved a selective cull of the weakest animals and a strategic sale that would generate enough capital to both expand the herd and hire the hands, with enough left over to cover the most critical of the deferred repairs. Theodore read through her figures carefully. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "I watched men do it wrong for long enough that I figured out how to do it right," she said. He looked up at her. "You could manage this whole operation," he said. "You know that." "I am aware," she said. "I have been helping manage it since November." He laughed, genuine and full, and she felt it in her bones. "You are right," he said. "You have been a pause, Alberta, Theodore." "I had intended to wait until the spring was further along," he said, "until things were more settled and the ranch was in better shape and I had something more to offer you." She looked at him across the kitchen table with his ledgers between them and the sound of the prairie through the open window and the smell of coffee in the room, and she said, "I am listening." "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "I am asking knowing that you are the most capable person I have ever met, and that you do not need me to provide for you, and that you are fully able to manage on your own." He paused. "I am asking because this ranch and this life and me and I are better with you in them than without you, and because I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd week of October and I have run out of patience for not telling you so." She was quiet for a moment. "October," she said. "What happened in October?" "You fixed the south fence in the rain," he said, "without being asked. And you came in at dinner and you did not complain about it at all. You just said the south fence was done and sat down and ate your meal. And I thought, that is the bravest person I have ever met in my life." She looked at him for a long time, this man with the flower on his hands and the scar on his jaw and the poetry by his bed and the 7-year-old daughter who had already decided everything. And she thought about the job nobody wanted and the posting in the window of the general store and 43 cents in her pocket. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his hand was warm and rough and steady, and he held hers the way you hold something you have been afraid of losing. "Me is going to be insufferable about this," Alberta said. Absolutely insufferable, he agreed, still holding her hand and smiling the smile that she had decided was one of the best things the world had to offer. Me was, as predicted, insufferable in the most delightful way possible. She announced the engagement to Samuel and Eli at breakfast the following morning before either Theodore or Alberta had a chance to say anything, and she stood on her chair to make the announcement with the formality of someone delivering important civic news. And Samuel and Eli both looked at Theodore and then at Alberta and then at each other, and Eli said, "About time," and Samuel said, "Are there celebrations?" "Because I would like to celebrate," and Theodore said, "Get off the chair, me," and me got off the chair but kept smiling for the rest of the morning. They were married in June of 1879, in the yard of the Broken Spur, on a day when the sky was the particular blue that Kansas does in early summer, vast and clear and enormous. The minister came from Caldwell, and the witnesses were Samuel and Eli Crest, and old Mrs. Perry from the neighboring property 3 miles east, who arrived in a buggy with a wedding cake she had made without being asked, because she said she had been watching this situation develop all winter from a distance, and it had been very satisfying. Alberta wore a dress that was the deep green of a cedar forest, which she had made herself over the preceding 2 months from fabric that Theodore had quietly ordered from a merchant in Wichita, and which she had found laid out on the kitchen table one morning with a note in his handwriting that said only, "For whenever you want it." She had stood in the kitchen holding the fabric for a long time before she folded it and went to work and cried exactly once, briefly and completely, in the privacy of the barn. Me wore her dress with the ribbons and carried a small bunch of prairie wildflowers and stood beside Alberta during the ceremony with the absolute solemnity of a child who understood that this was a serious and important moment, and who was also clearly the happiest person present. When the minister asked Theodore if he took Alberta to be his wife, he said, "I do," in a voice that was quiet and full and absolutely certain, looking at her the whole time, and she felt it land in her chest like something coming home. When she said her own vows, she meant every word with a completeness she had not known she was capable of until now. He put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been his grandmother's, which he told her afterward and which she thought was exactly right, something real and worn and with a history in it, and he held her hand after and did not let go for a long time. The summer of their first year of marriage was the fullest Alberta could remember. The plan she had laid out for the herd expansion worked. They hired 2 new hands, brothers named Crane from a ranch in Oklahoma that was closing, young men in their mid-20s who were hardworking and cheerful, and who fit into the Broken Spur crew with the ease of pieces finding their proper places. The fence line was repaired. The south barn was re-roofed. The cattle were healthy and the horses were well managed, and the accounts, when Alberta sat with them at the end of August, showed a surplus that had not been there at the beginning of the year. Theodore looked at the numbers for a long time. "When you showed up at my door in August of last year," he said, "the ranch had 4 months left before I would have had to make a very hard decision." She looked at him. "I did not tell you that when you arrived," he said. "I thought if I told you how badly I needed the help, you would know you had more leverage and ask for more pay." She thought about this for a moment. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. "I am telling you now. You should have asked for more help earlier," she said. "You should not have waited until you were 4 months from the edge." "I know that too," he said. She reached over and put her hand over his. "Do not wait that long again," she said. "That is the only thing I am asking." He turned his hand over and held hers. "I will not," he said. "I promise." Cutter Rhodes made one final visit in September. He came alone again in the morning, and the yard of the Broken Spur was busy with activity. The Crane brothers working on the new section of fence by the gate, Samuel overseeing the cattle in the south field, Eli repairing equipment near the barn. Theodore and Alberta met him together, standing side by side, and Alberta had the accounts with her because she had been going over them and had simply not set them down when she heard the horse. Rhodes looked around the yard for a long time. He looked at the repaired fence, and the painted barn and the healthy cattle visible in the field, and the 4 hands working with the ease of a crew that knew what it was doing. He looked at Alberta and at Theodore, and at the accounts in Alberta's hands with the expression of a man who has been playing a long game and has just realized the board has shifted in a way he did not expect. "You have had a good season," he said. "We have," Theodore said. "My offer has been declined," Theodore said. "Multiple times. I am not going to decline it again because I am not going to receive it again. This land is not for sale. It is not going to be for sale. Whatever circumstances you were counting on have changed." Rhodes looked at Alberta. "This was your doing," he said, and it was not quite an accusation and not quite a compliment and sat somewhere between the two. "I work here," she said. "It is my job to make sure things go well." He looked at them both for another moment, and she could see him running the same arithmetic she had run, adding up the crew and the state of the ranch and the accounts in her hands, and arriving at the same answer she had arrived at months ago, which was that the story he had been telling was no longer true. "Good day," he said, and turned his horse and rode away, and he did not come back. Theodore looked at her. "That is the last we will see of him," she said. "I believe you are right," he said. She looked down at the accounts and then back at him. "The numbers are very good," she said, "better than I projected." "Because you projected conservatively," he said. "I always project conservatively," she said. "It is how you avoid unpleasant surprises." "Is there anything else in those numbers?" he asked, with a look that she recognized as meaning he already knew the answer and was asking her to say it. She looked at him steadily. "The ranch can comfortably support another hand," she said, "and potentially a small expansion of the horse operation. You are well regarded in the region as a horseman, and there is a market for well-trained horses that I think we are not fully utilizing." He took the accounts from her and looked at them and then looked at her. "The horse operation is a good idea," he said. "I have been thinking about it for 2 years." "Then we should stop thinking about it and do it," she said. "We," he said. She smiled. "We." The horse expansion was the beginning of a new chapter for the Broken Spur. Theodore had a genuine gift with horses that went beyond the practical knowledge most ranchers carried, a patience and a sensitivity that the animals responded to, and Alberta had a business mind for it, knowing what buyers wanted and what prices the market would bear and how to build the kind of reputation that brought buyers back. Within 2 years, the Broken Spur was known through 3 counties for the quality of its trained horses, and the income from the horse sales had allowed them to pay off a significant portion of the mortgage and hire a 6th hand, a young man from a Cheyenne family named Henry who had grown up on the plains and who had a way with cattle that was extraordinary. Me had grown accustomed to Alberta in the way that a child grows accustomed to a thing that has become essential, which is to say, she no longer noticed the accustomization, because it had become simply the way things were. She called Alberta Mama for the first time one morning in October of 1879, casually and without announcement, as though she had been doing it all along, and Alberta had had to go outside and stand in the yard for 5 minutes to compose herself before she came back in and made breakfast as though nothing had happened, which did not fool Theodore for a moment, but which he had the wisdom to allow her. In the spring of 1880, Alberta told Theodore she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, early in the morning before anyone else was up, and she told him the way she told him most things, directly and without dramatics, and he sat with it for a moment the way he sat with things that mattered very much, and then he came around the table and took her face in his hands and said, "Are you well?" And she said, "I am very well," and he held her for a long time in the early morning light of the kitchen they had made their own. Their son was born in November of 1880, on a cold, clear night when the stars were extraordinary over the Kansas prairie. He came into the world with a set of lungs that left no doubt about his opinions and a head of dark hair that was his father's, and Theodore held him in the kitchen while the doctor finished his work, and looked at this small, outraged person in his arms with an expression of utter undone tenderness that Alberta, watching from the bed, added to the collection of images she kept in the part of herself that was purely happy. They named him James Theodore Hawkins, after no one in particular, because they liked the name and it suited him. Me received her brother with the seriousness she brought to all important matters, inspecting him at close range on her first introduction, and then declaring, "He is small, but he seems capable," which was perhaps the most me-like assessment possible, and which made Alberta laugh for the first time since before the labor, which was a relief to everyone. Life on the Broken Spur in the years that followed had the quality of something being built with care. Not without difficulty, because no life worth living is without it, but with the kind of difficulty that makes a thing stronger rather than smaller. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ongoing work of managing a growing operation. There were the ordinary frictions of living in close quarters with people you love, the negotiations and the misunderstandings and the making of peace. There were moments of absolute grace, a morning when the light came over the eastern fields in gold, and the whole ranch was briefly, perfectly beautiful. There was me growing tall and sharp and generous, developing her mother's practicality and her father's patience in a combination that suggested she was going to be formidable. There was James learning to walk in the kitchen and immediately attempting to follow the hands to the barn with the determination of a person who has decided what they want to do and sees no reason to wait. Theodore expanded the horse operation in 1882 to include training for long-distance riding, which opened a market with the army and with the cattle drives that came through the region. It was Alberta who had the idea, after a conversation with a scout who had stopped at the ranch looking for remounts, and mentioned the quality of the Broken Spur horses in a way that suggested she was not taking full advantage of what she had. "You could train specifically for endurance," she said to Theodore that evening. "It is a different market than what you have been targeting, but the prices are considerably better." "It would require a separate training program," he said. "I have already worked out what it would require," she said, and produced a paper from her pocket. He took it and read it and looked at her. "How long have you been carrying that around?" "3 days," she said. "I wanted to think it through before I brought it to you." "And you thought it through and decided I should know immediately," he said. "I thought it through and decided the opportunity was time-sensitive," she said. He smiled and put the paper on the table. "Let us do it," he said. She reflected, possibly the most fortunate person in Kansas. In the summer of 1883, Alberta became aware that she was expecting again. She and Theodore had talked about more children in the easy, open way they talked about most things, and she was glad for it. But she was also honest with herself that 2 children and a growing ranch operation was a great deal to manage, and she spent approximately 4 days thinking about this before she told him, during which time Theodore noticed she was thinking about something significant and waited for her to be ready to say it. When she told him, he said, "Are you well?" Again, because it was the first thing he always asked, the most important thing, and she said, "I am well. I am also thinking through the logistics." "What do you need?" he asked. "I need us to hire someone specifically for the household," she said. "Me is old enough to be more help than she was, but she should not be the household manager, and I cannot do everything I am currently doing and also have a new infant." "Done," he said. "Just like that," she said. "Alberta," he said, in the tone he used when he was about to say something that he felt should be obvious, "you have turned this ranch from something that was failing into something that is genuinely thriving. If you tell me you need someone to help manage the house, I am not going to make you negotiate for it." She looked at him for a moment. "You are a reasonable man," she said. "I have been told," he said. Their second child was a girl, born in February of 1884, on a quieter night than James's arrival, steady and unhurried, and she came into the world with her mother's red hair and her father's dark eyes, which was a combination that startled the doctor into commenting on it. They named her Clara Alice Hawkins, and me received her with considerably more confidence than she had received James, having now had practice, and held her immediately, and did not let anyone else have a turn for quite some time. The woman they hired for the household was named Rosa, a widow in her 40s who had come to Kansas from the East after her husband's death, and who managed the domestic side of the Broken Spur with an efficiency and warmth that was, Alberta thought, exactly what the house had needed. She and Alberta understood each other within the first week in the way that competent women who respect each other do, and the Broken Spur became something fuller and warmer than it had been before. Life settled into a new rhythm, the comfortable and deeply satisfying rhythm of a family that has found its shape. Theodore and Alberta moved through their days with the ease of two people who have learned each other fully, who know the texture of the other's silences and the cadence of their thinking, who have become so thoroughly intertwined that the idea of separation has ceased to be a real concept and become simply an abstraction. He still made coffee in the mornings before anyone else was up, and he still saved her the first cup, and she still found him with his ledgers in the evenings and his book of poetry by the lamp, though she had given him 2 more books to add to the shelf over the years. She still fixed things without being asked, because it was simply her way, and he still noticed and said, "Good catch," or "good thinking," in the flat, quiet voice that meant he was moved by something and was being careful about it. Me, at 12, was a person of remarkable character, who could ride any horse on the property, who helped with the training program with a seriousness that Theodore said would make her an excellent horsewoman if she chose it, who read everything she could get her hands on and who had opinions about all of it. She called Alberta Mama as naturally as breathing and had from the age of 8, and the fact that Alberta had come to this family through a job advertisement, rather than any other route, was simply a fact, like the way the creek ran north or the way the south pasture grew better than the north in a wet year. James, at 4, was the physical embodiment of what happened when Theodore Hawkins's determination met Alberta Wells's stubbornness, which was that you got a small person who knew exactly what he wanted and was willing to put in the work to get it. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's directness and a particular attachment to the gray mare Dust, who had outlived Alberta's predictions and was now 18 years old and still allowed only Alberta, and apparently, James to shoe her without complaint. Clara, at 1 year old, was largely occupied with the business of learning to exist in the world, which she approached with great enthusiasm and volume. On a warm evening in the early autumn of 1885, Theodore and Alberta sat on the porch of the house they had been repairing and improving for years, until it had become genuinely lovely. A house with a wide porch and real glass in all the windows, and a kitchen that Rosa had made into something beautiful, and a bedroom that was full of their accumulated life together. The children were in bed and the hands were in the bunkhouse and the prairie was doing its evening thing, the light going golden and then copper and then the deep blue that came before the stars, and they sat with their coffee and were quiet. "Do you remember the posting?" Theodore asked. She smiled. "In the window of the general store. 6 weeks it sat there," he said. 3 men walked away without knocking," she said. "And you knocked like you had already decided," he said. "I had already decided," she said. He reached over and took her hand the same way he had reached across the kitchen table on the day she had said yes to him, and she felt it the same way she had felt it then, warm and certain and like coming home. "What would have happened," he said, "if you had not wanted that job?" She thought about it honestly. "I would have found another job somewhere else," she said, "and I would have been fine, but I would not have been this. She looked at the ranch, at the repaired fence line and the well-maintained barn and the horses moving in the far field, and at the house with the light in Me's window where the girl was undoubtedly still reading, and at the man beside her. "Happy," she said simply. "I would not have been this happy." He was quiet for a moment in his way. Then he said, "Neither would I." They sat until the stars came out, which in Kansas is a thing worth sitting for. the sky going dark and wide and then filling up from horizon to horizon with more light than you could count, the Milky Way laid across it like a river, and the prairie below it quiet and enormous and utterly itself. Alberta thought about a woman on a stagecoach with 43 cents and a carpetbag, and a determination she had not yet finished testing. She thought about a posting in a window and a door she had knocked on, and a rancher with flour on his hands and a scar on his jaw and a lamp burning in the kitchen. She thought about a 7-year-old girl with a one-eyed rabbit who had decided on the first evening that Alberta was going to stay. She had stayed. She had stayed, and she had worked, and she had loved, and she had built something here that was real and full and entirely hers. And Theodore's, and me's, and James's, and Clara's, and the broken spurs. All of it bound together in the particular and irreplaceable way that a life becomes a life when it is lived fully and without apology. The stars turned slowly overhead, and the wind came across the prairie, and the coffee cooled in their cups, and neither of them moved, because there was nowhere else to be and nothing that needed doing at this precise moment except exactly this. "Theodore," she said, "yes, I am glad I took the job nobody wanted." He turned his head and looked at her in the starlight, and the look on his face was the one she had been cataloging for years now, the full and unguarded one he reserved for moments of complete honesty, and he said, "I am the most glad." She laughed, low and warm, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the Broken Spur ranch house with the stars burning above the Kansas plains. And everything was resolved and everything was whole, and the life they had built together out of hard work and stubborn hope was exactly as large and exactly as real as the country that surrounded it, and neither of them, not for a single moment, would have wished it otherwise. In the spring of 1886, Mee turned 15 and announced that she intended to run the horse training program one day, and Alberta sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at this girl who had been entrusted to her in the most unusual and wonderful way. This girl who had her father's eyes and her own hard-won wisdom and a directness that was entirely her own, and said, "I know. You have been ready for it for 2 years." Mee grinned, bright and sure, and said, "I learned from watching you." Alberta thought this was the finest compliment she had ever received. The Broken Spur grew in the years that followed. The horse training program became what Alberta had always believed it could be, well regarded throughout the territory, and the cattle operation was solid and profitable, and managed with the care that Theodore had always brought to it, and that Alberta had refined in ways that were now so integrated into how it was done that no one remembered they had ever been different. Henry, the young man from a Cheyenne family who had joined them years ago, became their most senior hand, a fixture of the place, someone whose knowledge of the land and animals had become indispensable in the best possible way. James learned to ride at 3 and was competent at 5, and by 7 was helping in the horse training with a patience that was clearly his father's and a technical mind for it that was, Theodore said, entirely his mother's. Clara was growing into a child of fierce opinions and considerable charm, who had her mother's red hair and her father's steady thoughtfulness, and who had decided at the age of 4 that her best friend was a spotted dog named Governor who followed her everywhere. The ranch hands came and went over the years as ranch hands did, but the core of it, Samuel and Eli Crest and Henry and Rosa, remained, and the Broken Spur was a place where people stayed not because they had to, but because it was worth staying for. Theodore and Alberta grew into each other the way trees grow in proximity, shaped by each other's presence, the grain of their lives running parallel and intertwined. He still made her coffee first in the mornings. She still fixed things without being asked. He still read poetry by the lamp. She still sat with the accounts on Sunday evenings and found ways to make the numbers say better things than they had said before. They argued occasionally, as two people with strong views and genuine respect for each other will argue, cleanly, and with the confidence of people who know the argument is not a threat to the thing between them. She had never, not once, regretted the door she had knocked on. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, Theodore brought her out to the north pasture at sunset, the pasture that Cutter Rhodes had wanted and never gotten, the best grazing land on the property, and they stood at the fence and watched the cattle and the light change, and he told her, in the way he told her important things, quietly and completely, that the broken spur was in better shape than it had ever been in its history, that the mortgage was paid, that the horses had won them a reputation that was bringing buyers from as far as Colorado, and that Mee had told him that morning that she wanted to study livestock management properly, with a real teacher, and he thought they should find a way to make that happen. Alberta listened to all of this with the accounts already running in her head, which she suspected he knew, and then she turned and looked at him in the evening light and said, "We can make that happen." "I know we can," he said. "You will find a way." "We will find a way," she said. He smiled, and it was the real one, the full one, the one that was still the best thing she knew. "We will find a way," he agreed. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and golden in the last of the day's light, and the horses ran along the fence line in the far field, beautiful and fast, and the smoke was rising from the ranch house kitchen, where Rosa was making supper, and somewhere in the house Mee was reading, and James was doing something that would require explaining later, and Clara was following the spotted dog governor across the yard. The stars were coming out, one by one, the way they always did over Kansas, patient and enormous and indifferent to human trouble, and therefore strangely comforting. Alberta Wells Hawkins stood on the land she had come to on a stagecoach with 43 cents and a carpetbag, the land nobody had wanted to work, the job nobody had applied for, the life that had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to knock on the door without walking away, and she felt the particular and irreplaceable fullness of a person who is exactly where they belong. Theodore put his arm around her shoulders, and she put her arm around his waist, and they stood together in the way that people stand who have made something real out of difficult materials and know it and are grateful for it. And the last light went gold and then deep red and then the purple that precedes the dark, and the stars opened up above Kansas in all their cold and splendid abundance. This was the broken spur. This was hers. This was theirs. And it was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough and more.